Chapter 3. Second Marriage, Second Children. Fyodor, having packed off the 4-year-old Mitya, very soon married for a second time. This second marriage lasted about 8 years. He took his second wife, Sofia Ivanovna, also a very young person from another province, where he happened to have gone for a bit contracting business in the company of some little Jew. Fyodor Pavlovich, though he led a wild, drunken, and debauched life, still never stopped investing his capital and always managed his deals successfully, though of course almost always somewhat shabbily. Sofia Ivanovna was one of our little orphans, left without relations in early childhood, the daughter of some obscure deacon who grew up in the rich house of her benefactress, mistress, and tormentress, an aristocratic old lady, the widow of the General Volokhonsky. I do not know the details, but have only heard that it seems the ward, who was a meek, gentle, uncomplaining girl, was once taken out of a noose that she had hung from a nail in the closet. So hard was it for her to endure the wilfulness and eternal nagging of the old woman, who was apparently not wicked, but had become a most insufferable crank from sheer idleness. Fyodor offered his hand. Inquiries were made, and he was turned away. And then once again, as with his first marriage, he suggested elopement to the little orphan. Most likely she would not have married him for anything if she had learned more about him in time. But she lived in another province, and what could a 16-year-old girl understand except that she would rather drown herself than stay with her benefactress? So the poor girl traded a benefactress for a benefactor. Fyodor did not get a penny this time, because the general's widow was furious, refused to give anything, and moreover, cursed them both. Yet this time he did not even count on getting anything, but was tempted only by the innocent girl's remarkable beauty, and above all by her innocent look, which struck the sensualist who until then had been depraved admirer only for the coarser kind of feminine beauty. "Those innocent eyes cut my soul like a razor," he used to say afterwards with his disgusting little snigger. However, in a depraved man this too might be only a sensual attraction. As he had gotten no reward, Fyodor did not stand on ceremony with his wife, and taking advantage of the fact that she was, so to speak, guilty before him, and that he had practically saved her from the noose, taking advantage, besides that of her phenomenal humility and meekness, he even trampled with both feet on ordinary decency of marriage. Loose women would gather in the house right in front of his wife, and orgies took place. I should report as a characteristic feature that the servant Gregory, a gloomy, stupid, and obstinate pedant, who had hated his former mistress, Adelaida Ivanovna, this time took the side of the new mistress, defended her, and abused Fyodor because of her in a manner hardly befitting a servant, and on one occasion even broke up the orgy and drove all sandalless women out of the house. Later, this happy young woman, who had been terrorized since childhood, came down with something like a kind of feminine nervous disorder, most often found among simply village women, who are known as shriekers because of it. From this disorder, accompanied by terrible hysterical fits, the sick woman would sometimes even lose her reason. Nevertheless, she bore Fyodor 2 sons, Ivan and Alexei, the first in the first year of marriage, the second 3 years later. When she died, the boy Alexei was in 4th year, and though it is strange, I know that he remembered his mother all his life, as if though sleep, of course. After her death, almost exactly the same thing happened with both boys as happened with the first one, Mitya. They were totally forgotten and forsaken by their father, and wound up in the same cottage with the same servant, Grigory. It was in this cottage that they were found by that old crank, the general's widow, their mother, mistress, and benefactress. She was still alive, and in all that time, for all those 8 years, had not forgotten the injury done her. For all those 8 years, she had been receiving underhandedly the most exact information about her Sophia's life, and hearing how ill she was and in what outrageous surroundings she had allowed 2 or 3 times to her lady companions. It serves her right. God has sent it to her for her ingratitude. Exactly 3 months after Sofia Ivanovna's death, the general's widow suddenly appeared in presence in our town, right at Fyodor Pavlovich's house. She spent only about half an hour in our little town, but she accomplished a great deal. It was evening. Fyodor, whom she had not seen for all those 8 years, was tipsy when he came out to her. They said that the moment she saw him, without any explanation, she at once delivered him 2 good, resounding slaps and jerked him 3 times by his forelock. Then, without adding a word, she made straight for the cottage, and the 2 boys, seeing at glance that they were unwashed and in dirty shirts, she gave one more slap to Grigory himself and announced to him that she was taking both children home with her. Then carried them outside just as they were, wrapped them in plaid, put them in the carriage, and took them to her own town. Grigory bore his slap like a devoted slave, without a word of abuse, and while helping the old lady to her carriage, he bowed low and said imposingly that God would reward her for the orphans, and you are a lout all the same. The general's widow shouted as he drove away. Fyodor, thinking the whole thing over, found that it was a good thing, and in a formal agreement regarding his children's education by the general's widow, did not afterward object at any point. As for the slaps he had gotten, he drove all over town telling the story himself. It so happened that the general's widow too died soon after that. In her will, however, she set aside 1,000 rubles for each of the little ones, for their education, and so that the money will spend only on them, but in a way that will make it last until their coming of age. For it is quite enough of a handout for such children, and if anyone else want to, let him loosen his own purse strings. And so on and so forth. I did not read the will myself, but I have heard that there was indeed something strange of this sort in it, and rather peculiarly expressed. The old woman's principal hire, however, turned out to be an honest man, the provincial marshal of nobility of that province, Yefim Petrovich Polenov. After an exchange of letters with Fyodor, he guessed at once that no one could drag any money out of him even for education of his own children, though he never refused directly, but in such cases always simply delayed, sometimes even pouring out sentimentalities. He took a personal interest in the orphans and came especially to love the younger one, Alexei, who for a long time even grew up in his family. I should like the reader to remember that from the very beginning, if there was any one to whom the brothers were indebted from their upbringing and education for the rest of their life, it was this Yefim Petrovich, a most generous and humane man of any rarely found. The 1,000 left to the little ones by the general widow he kept intact, so that by the time they came of age, each 1,000 which interest had grown to 2,000, and meanwhile he educated them at his own expense, certainly spending far more than 1,000 on each boy. Again, for the time being, I will not go into a detailed account of their childhood and adolescence, but will note the most important circumstances. However, of the elder Ivan, I will only say that as he was growing up, he was somehow gloomy and withdrawn, far from timid, but as if he had already perceived by the age of 10 that they were indeed living in someone else's family and on someone else's charity, that their father was such that it was a shame to speak of him, and so on and so forth. The boy began very clearly, almost in fancy, so they say at least, to show some sort of unusual and brilliant aptitude for learning. I do not know exactly how, but it somehow happened that he parted from Yefim Petrovich's family when he was barely 13, passing on to one of the Moscow secondary schools and boarding with a certain experienced and then famous pedagog, a childhood friend of Yefim Petrovich. Ivan himself used to say afterward that it all happened, so to speak, because of the ardor for good works of Yefim Petrovich, who was carried away by the idea that a boy of genius must also be educated by educator of genius. However, neither Yefim nor the educator of genius was living when the young man, having finished school, entered university. Yefim left his affairs in disarray and owing to red tape and the various formalities quite unavoidable among us, there was a delay in obtaining the child's own money, left to them by the cranky widow, which had grown from 1,000 to 2,000 with interest, so that for his first 2 years at the university, the young man found himself in a pickle, since he was forced all the while both to feed and keep himself and to study at the same time. It must be noted that he did not even try at the same time to communicate with his father, perhaps out of pride or contempt for him, perhaps because his cold common sense told him that he would not get even the smallest token of support from his papa. Be that as it may, the young man was not at all at a loss, and did succeed in finding work, at first giving lessons at 20 kopecks an hour, and then running around to newspaper publishers, plying them with 10-line articles on street incidents, signed Eyewitness. These little articles, they say, were always so curiously and quantitatively written that they were soon in great demand. And even in this alone, the young man demonstrated his practical and intellectual superiority over that eternally needy and miserable mass of our students of both sexes, who in our capitals, from morning till night, habitually haunt the doorways of various newspapers and magazines, unable to invent anything better than the eternal repetition of one and the same plea for copying work on translations from the French. Having made the acquaintance of the editors, Ivan Fyodorovich never broke his connection with them. Afterwards, in his later years at the university, began to publish rather talented reviews of books on various specific subjects, so that he even became known in some literary circles. However, it was only quite recently that he had succeeded by accident in suddenly attracting to himself the particular attention of much wider circle of readers, so that a great many people at once noticed and remembered him. The incident was rather curious. Having already graduated from the university, and while preparing to go abroad on his 2,000 rubles, Ivan Fyodorovich suddenly published in one of the big newspapers a strange article that attracted the attention even of non-experts, and above all on a subject apparently altogether foreign to him. Since he had graduated in natural science, the article dealt with the issues of ecclesiastical codes, which was then being raised everywhere. While analyzing some already existing opinions of the subject, he also expressed his own view. The main thing was the tone of the article and its remarkably unexpected conclusion. And yet many churchmen decidedly counted the author as one of their own. Suddenly, however, along with them, not only secularists but even atheists themselves began to applaud from their side. Finally, some quick-witted people concluded that the whole article was just a brazen farce and mockery. I mention this incident particularly because the article in time also penetrated our famous neighboring monastery, where there was general interest in the newly emerged issue of ecclesiastical codes, penetrated and produced complete bewilderment. When they learned the author's name, they become interested in the fact that he was a native of our town and a son of that very same Fyodor Pavlovich. And then suddenly, just at that time, the author himself appeared among us. When Ivan came to us, then is a question I even recall asking myself at the time, almost with a certain uneasiness. This so fateful arrival, which was the start of so many consequences, long afterwards remained almost always unclear to me. Generally considered, it was strange that so learned, so proud, and seemingly so prudent a young man should suddenly appear in such a scandalous house before such a father who had ignored him all his life, who did not know or remember him, and who, though if his son had asked, he would certainly not have given him any money for anything in the world or under any circumstances. Nonetheless, was afraid all his life that his son Ivan and Alexei too would one day come and ask for money. And here the young man comes to live in the house of such a father, lives with him for 1 month, then for another, and then yet get along famously. This last fact specially astonished not only me but many others as well. Pyotr Musov, whom I have already mentioned, a distant relation of Fyodor through his first wife, happened to be in the neighborhood again at the same time on his nearby estate, paying us a visit from Paris, where he had already settled permanently. I remember it was precisely he who marveled most of all when he got acquainted with the young man who interested him greatly and with whom he used, not without inner pangs, to have occasional intellectual altercations. He is proud, he used to say to us about him. He will always have something in his pocket, and even now he has enough money to go abroad. What does he want here? It's clear to everyone that he did not come to his father for money, because in any case his father won't give it to him. He doesn't like drinking and debauchery, and yet the old man can't do without him. They get along so well. It was true. The young man even had a noticeable influence over the old man. The latter almost began to listen him occasionally, though he was extremely and at sometimes even spitefully willful. He even began sometime to behave more decently. Only later did we learn that Ivan had come partly at the request and on the behalf of his elder brother Dmitri, whom he met and saw for the first time in his life on this visit, but with whom, however, he had entered into correspondence prior to his arrival from Moscow, on the occasion of a certain important matter of more concern to Dmitri Fyodorovich than to himself. What that matter was, the reader will learn fully and in detail in due time. Nevertheless, even when I already knew about this special circumstance, Ivan Fyodorovich still seemed to me a mysterious person, and his arrival among us still inexplicable. I will add that Ivan Fyodorovich seemed at the time to be mediator and conciliator between his father and his eldest brother Dmitri, who had gotten into a great quarrel with his father and had even started for proceedings against him. This nice little family, I repeat, got together then for the first time, and some of its members saw each other for the first time in their lives. Only the youngest brother, Alexei Fyodorovich, had been living in our parts already for about a year, and so had to come us before the rest of his brother. It is about this very Alexei that it is most difficult for me to speak in my introductory story, before bringing him on stage in the novel. Still, I shall have to write an introduction from him as well, if only to give a preliminary explanation of one very strange point, namely, that I must present my future hero to the reader. From the first scene of this novel, dressed in the cassock of novice, yes, at that time he had been living for about a year in our monastery, and it seemed he was preparing to set himself up in for the rest of his life.